"Can I take these 2 pieces of chicken home?" The entire restaurant seemed to go still when Ryan Carter, a waiter, looked directly at Scarlett Hayes and asked that question after she had finished her meal. Scarlett glanced at him at his worn uniform, his careful posture, and let out a short, quiet laugh. She assumed she understood the situation completely. A grown man working a service job asking to take home leftover food from a customer's plate. She said nothing generous in return. Hours later, walking to her car, she saw him crouched beside a homeless man on a cold sidewalk, handing over those exact 2 pieces of chicken. If he wasn't hungry, why had he asked for them at all? Ryan Carter had worked the dinner floor at Hayes' Dining Group for almost 2 years, and in that time, he had learned to make himself invisible in the right moments. He moved between tables with the kind of quiet efficiency that experienced servers develop, not rushed, not slow, and just steady. His uniform was always clean, even if it had been washed 1 too many times. His shoes were polished. He smiled at the right moments, stayed silent at the right moments, and never gave anyone a reason to look at him twice. That was the job. You showed up, you performed, you disappeared at the end of the night. The restaurant itself was the kind of place where people came to be seen: exposed brick walls, softened by warm lighting, a menu that changed seasonally, tablecloths pressed flat enough to reflect the candlelight. Scarlett Hayes had built the Hayes Dining Group from a single location into a name that carried weight in the city. She didn't run the floor herself anymore, but she still appeared without warning, usually mid-service, usually when no one was expecting her. The staff had learned to read the room the moment she walked in. Backs straightened, voices dropped. Errors that might have passed unnoticed suddenly felt catastrophic. Ryan didn't tense up the way some of the others did. He had been through enough in the past few years that a CEO walking through a dining room didn't rank very high on the list of things worth being afraid of. He simply adjusted, kept his service tighter, his pacing more deliberate, and went about his evening. On the night the whole thing started, Scarlett was seated at table 9, a corner booth that the host always kept reserved for management visits or high-profile guests. She came in alone, ordered the roasted half-chicken with seasonal vegetables, and spent most of the meal looking at her phone. Ryan handled her table without incident. He refilled her water glass twice, brought the bread without being asked, and cleared each course at the right tempo. She didn't look at him directly. That was normal. A lot of the guests at that tier didn't. When she finished her meal, more than half the chicken remained on the plate. It was common portions at Hayes were generous by design, and guests of Scarlett's caliber rarely cleaned their plates. Ryan began clearing the table, stacking the dishes with practiced efficiency. Then he noticed the 2 pieces of chicken sitting intact at the edge of the plate. They hadn't been touched. Still warm. Still whole. He stood there for a moment with the plate in his hand. Then he made a decision. "Ms. Hayes," he said, keeping his voice low and even, "would it be all right if I took these 2 pieces of chicken home?" The table nearby went quiet first. Then the quiet spread. It wasn't a loud moment. It was the kind of silence that fills a room when something unexpected has been said, and everyone is trying to figure out what they just heard. Scarlett looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. She looked at Ryan, really looked at him, and something moved across her face that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite contempt, but landed somewhere between the two. She set her phone down on the table and leaned back slightly. "Excuse me," she said. "The chicken," Ryan said. "You didn't finish it. I was going to ask if I could take it home instead of sending it back to the kitchen." The silence in the nearby section deepened. A server 2 tables over had stopped moving. One of the junior managers near the host stand had turned to look. Scarlett glanced around the room, and Ryan watched her register the audience. He could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was deciding what version of this moment she wanted to create. She turned back to him and smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. "You're asking me," she said, "if you can take leftover food off my plate to bring home." She let the sentence sit there for a moment before continuing. You're a grown man. You're working a full shift at a restaurant that serves food all night, and you're asking me if you can take home 2 pieces of chicken." Ryan didn't say anything. He kept his face neutral. "I don't know what your situation is," Scarlett continued her voice, carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables without being a shout. "But I'd think a man your age would find a better way to handle dinner than asking a customer for her leftovers." A few guests at the surrounding tables shifted in their seats. Someone let out a quiet sound that might have been a laugh or might have been discomfort. Ryan held the plate and said nothing. He didn't look down, didn't look away. He simply waited. Scarlett waved one hand toward the plate. "Go ahead. Take them." Ryan gave a single composed nod. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes." He carried the plate to the kitchen, packaged the 2 pieces of chicken in a to-go container, and placed it in his bag in the back room. His co-worker, a younger server named Patrick, caught him in the hallway near the service station. Patrick looked like he wanted to say something sympathetic and didn't quite know how to start. "That was rough," Patrick finally said. "It was fine," Ryan replied, and went back out to finish his section. He moved through the rest of the service with the same steadiness he had carried all night. The remaining tables needed water, dessert, menus, check, presentations. He delivered all of it without missing a beat. If he was bothered by what had happened at table 9, it didn't show. Not in his posture, not in the way he spoke to guests, not in the expression he wore as he wrapped up his closing side work. When the last table cleared and the floor crew began breaking down stations, Ryan clocked out, said a brief goodnight to the staff he passed near the door, and walked out into the cold. The city at that hour was quiet in patches. A few bars still lit on the cross streets, a delivery truck idling at the corner, the kind of half-empty urban stillness that settles in after 10 o'clock on a weeknight. Ryan walked north along the front of the building, then turned left at the corner toward the small plaza that sat between the restaurant's front entrance and the main street beyond. Most of the floor staff parked 2 blocks further east, and the plaza was the most direct path through. He had his jacket buttoned against the cold and his bag on one shoulder. Scarlett Hayes was still in the building when he left. She had stayed to speak with the general manager after service, a routine check-in she did when she visited a location. She came out through the front entrance, roughly 15 minutes after Ryan had gone, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the car her driver had pulled around to the main street. Her route took her through the same plaza. That was when she saw him. Ryan was crouched down on the sidewalk at the far edge of the plaza, near the low wall that ran along the building's north face. A man in a heavy canvas jacket was sitting with his back against the wall, his legs stretched out in front of him. The man looked old in the way that hard living makes people look old. Face weathered beyond his years, hands roughened the kind of stillness that comes from having nowhere particular to be. Ryan had opened the to-go container and was holding it out to the man. The man took it with both hands, and Ryan stayed where he was, crouched at eye level, while the man began to eat. He ate the way people eat when a real meal has been a long time coming, steadily, head slightly down, focused. Ryan didn't say much. He said something, but Scarlett was too far away to hear it. Whatever it was brief. The old man nodded without looking up from the container. Ryan watched for a few more seconds, then picked up his bag, and walked away down the far side of the plaza toward the eastern parking blocks. He didn't look back. He didn't seem to be waiting for anything in return. Scarlett stood on the plaza path with her phone in her hand, and didn't move. She had built a career on reading people. It was a skill she had sharpened across more than 15 years of business, knowing within a few minutes of meeting someone what they wanted, what they were afraid of, what they would do under pressure. She had believed, without examining it very carefully, that she could assess a situation accurately from the surface. A man asking to take leftover food off a paying customer's plate told one story. That story seemed obvious. That story seemed complete, except the man she had assessed was now walking away in the cold without the food he had asked for, having given it to someone else entirely. Scarlett's car was waiting at the curb beyond the plaza. Her driver had the engine running. She stood there for a moment longer than she should have, looking at the space where Ryan had been crouching at the old man, still eating from the white container, at the quiet stretch of sidewalk, where a version of the evening she had been certain she understood had just reorganized itself into something she didn't. She got into the car. She didn't say anything to her driver. She looked out the window as the city moved past, and she thought about the expression on Ryan's face when she had spoken to him in the restaurant, how he had stood there, plate in hand, and absorbed every word she said, without flinching, without explaining, without asking for anything except the thing he had already asked for. He had known when he stood at that table what she would assume. He had heard the laugh, had registered the calculation behind her eyes, had listened to every word she said. And he had said nothing to correct her. He had simply taken the container and walked through the plaza to give it to a man sitting alone in the cold. Scarlett looked down at her phone. The screen had gone dark. She didn't unlock it. There were things she told herself regularly about the way the world worked, about effort and outcome, about people being responsible for the shape of their own lives, about the difference between those who built something and those who didn't. She had arranged these beliefs carefully and found them useful. They allowed her to make decisions quickly to move forward without too much friction, to run 3 restaurant locations and a corporate structure that employed over 200 people without losing momentum to doubt. But the beliefs she realized as the car turned toward her building were only useful if the assessments they were built on were accurate. And somewhere between the dining room and that plaza wall, her assessment of Ryan Carter had turned out to be wrong in a way she hadn't fully prepared for. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She put her phone in her bag, looked out at the street, and let the car carry her home. Scarlett didn't make a habit of second-guessing herself. It was one of the things she had trained out of her system early in her career, back when she was running the first Hayes location on borrowed capital and couldn't afford to spend energy relitigating decisions already made. You assessed, you moved, you adjusted if the numbers told you to. Feelings were not data. Doubt was expensive. But the image of Ryan crouching on that plaza sidewalk stayed with her in a way she hadn't anticipated. It was still there the following morning when she reviewed the weekly floor reports from all 3 locations. It was still there 3 days later when she made another unannounced visit to the restaurant, this time arriving before the dinner rush, standing near the host stand with a coffee and watching the floor staff run their pre-service setup. She told herself she was there to evaluate operations. That was true. It was also not the complete truth. Ryan was already on the floor when she arrived working the afternoon overlap shift. She watched him from a distance, the way she watched all floor staff when she was assessing performance, looking for inefficiencies, lapses in presentation, the small failures that accumulated into larger problems over time. What she saw instead was something that didn't fit neatly into any evaluation framework she used. A server 2 stations over had miscounted her table assignments and was visibly behind on setup. Ryan finished his own section crossed over without being asked and spent 12 minutes helping her restock and reset before service began. He didn't announce it. He didn't check to see if anyone in management had noticed. He simply saw the problem, addressed it, and went back to his own station. Later during service, a guest at one of Ryan's tables became difficult, the kind of guest who found fault with everything as a way of asserting a particular kind of authority. The wine was the wrong temperature. The lighting was too dim. The bread arrived 30 seconds too late. Ryan handled each complaint with the same measured composure, offering solutions without defensiveness, never once letting the guest's tone shift his own. When the table finally left, Patrick, the same young server from the night of the incident, walked past and muttered something under his breath about the guest. Ryan just shook his head slightly and moved on. What struck Scarlett wasn't that Ryan was good at his job. Plenty of people on her floor were good at their jobs. What struck her was that he seemed entirely indifferent to whether anyone acknowledged it. He didn't carry himself like someone waiting to be noticed or promoted or praised. He carried himself like someone who had already decided what kind of person he was going to be, and was simply being that person, regardless of who was watching. She found that harder to categorize than she expected. Over the following week, she made a point of being present at the location more often than usual. She kept her distance, and she kept her observations to herself, but she was paying attention in a way she hadn't been before. She learned that Ryan regularly covered shifts for colleagues who came to him with genuine conflicts, not as a favor that would be repaid, but simply because the schedule needed filling and he was available. She learned that he had, on at least 2 separate occasions, declined cash tips that guests tried to press into his hand after particularly attentive service guests who were clearly trying to establish a dynamic that went beyond the standard transactional exchange of a restaurant meal. Ryan had thanked them and stepped back each time. One evening, she overheard a brief exchange near the service station between Ryan and a newer hire named Marcus, who had only been on the floor for 3 weeks. Marcus had made an error with a table's order, a substitution that hadn't been communicated to the kitchen, and was visibly rattled going into his next turn. Ryan pulled him aside for no more than 2 minutes, said something Scarlett couldn't hear from where she stood, and sent him back out. Whatever he said, it worked. Marcus steadied. He finished the service without further incident, and at the end of the night, he found Ryan near the coat hooks and said something that looked from a distance like genuine gratitude. Ryan waved it off and headed for the door. She also learned through a brief and careful conversation with the general manager that Ryan was not a man with financial ease. He was renting a small apartment on the east side of the city. His shifts were consistent, but not excessive. He wasn't broke in the way that triggered concern, but he wasn't comfortable in any way that made generosity easy. He was a man living close to the line, managing it with quiet discipline. That last detail was the one that sat with her most stubbornly. It was one thing to give away what you had plenty of. It was another thing entirely to give away what you had very little of, to look at your own shortage, and still find something in it worth handing to someone else. Scarlett had donated to causes over the years, had signed checks and attended galas, and put her name on initiatives that were good for the company's public profile. She had always told herself that giving at scale was more efficient than giving at the individual level. Systems over gestures, impact over sentiment. She had believed that. She was no longer entirely sure she had been right. The crack in her certainty widened the evening she stayed late at the restaurant and happened to look out the rear exit toward the alley that ran behind the building. Ryan was out there with a paper bag, moving with the easy familiarity of someone who had done this before. He wasn't alone. There was a man sitting on a flattened cardboard box near the far wall, somewhere in his 50s, with a wool cap pulled down over his ears and the particular kind of patience that comes from spending a lot of time waiting outdoors. Ryan set the bag down beside him, crouched to say something, and waited, while the man looked through the contents. The man found what he was looking for, a foil-wrapped container at the bottom of the bag, and held it with both hands, the way people hold things they intend to keep. Ryan stayed for a moment, said something else, and then came back inside. Scarlett stepped away from the door before he came back through. She didn't want him to know she had seen it. She wasn't entirely sure why, except that the moment felt like something private. Not a performance, not a gesture, designed to be witnessed, and she didn't want to contaminate it by making it into one. She went back to her office in the rear of the building and sat down. The quarterly reports were open on her laptop. She didn't read them. What she was beginning to understand, and what she found genuinely uncomfortable to sit with, was that Ryan Carter had not arrived at his current life because he had failed to try. She had assumed, without examining the assumption, that a 35-year-old man working a service job and struggling financially had simply not done enough, had not built enough, not planned enough, not been disciplined enough. That assumption had felt reasonable. It had felt fair. She had used a version of it to justify the words she said at Table 9, to make the moment feel like a lesson rather than a humiliation. But a man who worked with that level of integrity, who gave away food he couldn't easily replace, who helped people who couldn't help him. Back that man had not arrived where he was through lack of character. Something else had happened, something she didn't know yet. She was still thinking about that when the crisis arrived. It came without warning, the way most crises in the digital age arrived suddenly, and from a direction no one had been watching. A clip had surfaced online. Someone in the restaurant on the night of the Table 9 incident had recorded part of the exchange on their phone, not the whole thing, not the context, just the 30 seconds in which Scarlett had delivered her remarks about a grown man asking for leftovers. The audio was clear. Her voice was recognizable. The clip was short enough to be shared easily and long enough to be damaging. By the time Scarlett's communications director called her at 7 in the morning, the clip had been viewed more than 300,000 times. By noon, it was being picked up by local media outlets across 4 cities. By the following morning, it had crossed into national coverage, not as a major story, but as the kind of brief viral moment that news cycles swallowed and amplified before moving on. The Hayes Dining Group was named in every headline. Scarlett's name was in most of them. The board of directors requested an emergency call. Scarlett sat through it with the same composure she brought to every meeting, listening, as 4 different board members made 4 different versions of the same argument. The story needed to end the noise, needed to stop, and the fastest way to accomplish both was to remove the source of the controversy from the company's payroll. "Let him go quietly," one of the board members said. His name was Gerald Whitmore, and he had been on the Hayes board for 6 years. "Issue a brief statement expressing regret for any misunderstanding, offer Carter a modest severance, and the story dies in 48 hours. The alternative is that this drags on, and we spend the next 2 weeks managing a narrative that doesn't help anyone." No one on the call disagreed with Gerald Whitmore. Scarlett said she would handle it. What she didn't say was that she had already decided she would not be handling it the way Gerald Whitmore had suggested. She was in the middle of drafting a different kind of response when her general manager knocked on the office door with news that changed the shape of the morning entirely. Ryan had come in early. He had asked to speak with management, and he had submitted, in writing, a voluntary resignation, effective immediately, with no request for severance, no complaint filed, no conditions attached. Scarlett read the document twice. It was brief and clean, a single paragraph stating that he believed his continued presence at the location had become a distraction, and that he didn't want his situation to create problems for the company or for his colleagues. He thanked management for the opportunity and asked that his final paycheck be mailed to his address on file. There was nothing bitter in it, nothing resentful, nothing that suggested he expected anything in return. Scarlett set the document down on the desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then she asked her general manager to please let Ryan know that his resignation had not yet been accepted and that she would like to speak with him before any decision was finalized. Her manager looked uncertain. He seemed pretty committed to leaving Ms. Hayes. "I understand that," Scarlett said. "Ask him anyway." While she waited, she made a call to a former colleague who had some history with small business financing in the city. She gave him Ryan's name and asked a few careful questions. What she learned in the next 20 minutes rearranged everything she had been slowly assembling over the past 2 weeks into a shape that was suddenly completely clear. Ryan Carter had owned a business, a small logistics and delivery operation he had built from scratch over the course of 7 years. By every account, it had been legitimate, well-run, and growing. Then his wife had gotten sick, a serious illness that required full-time care and exhausted every financial resource he had. He had sold the business to cover medical costs. He had liquidated savings, closed accounts, and spent the next 18 months focused entirely on keeping her comfortable. When she died, there was nothing left of the financial structure he had built. He had started over at the bottom, taken the first stable job he could find, and rebuilt his routine around discipline and forward motion. He had never talked about any of it. Not to coworkers, not to management, Not to anyone at Hayes' dining group who might have changed how they looked at him. He had shown up, done the work, and kept the rest to himself. Scarlett sat at her desk with that information settling over her like cold water. She thought about the night at Table 9, the way she had looked at his worn uniform and his careful posture, and drawn every conclusion she needed from those two details alone. She thought about the things she had said in front of guests and colleagues, the dismissive certainty in her own voice, the brief laugh before she turned it into a lesson. She had been so sure she understood what she was looking at. She had been so completely wrong. Ryan appeared in the doorway of her office a few minutes later. He was in his uniform jacket, which told her he had already been on the floor before coming in to submit the resignation. He stood in the doorway, without leaning, without folding his arms, without any of the defensive body language she might have expected from a person who had spent 2 weeks at the center of a public controversy, not of his making. He just looked at her with the same steady composure she had been watching from across the dining room for the past several days. "You asked to see me," he said. "I did," Scarlett said. "I'd like you to sit down." Ryan sat down across from her desk, the way he did everything else without performance, without visible anxiety, without filling the silence with words that weren't necessary. He set his hands on his knees and waited. Scarlett had rehearsed the opening of this conversation 3 different ways in the 20 minutes since she had asked her manager to bring him in. Every version she had prepared felt insufficient now that he was actually sitting in front of her. There was something about his stillness that made careful phrasing feel dishonest, like wrapping something sharp in too much paper. She decided to say it plainly. "I know about your business," she said, "and about your wife. I made some calls this morning, and I found out more than I should have needed to find out, because I should have found a way to find out less about you while assuming more." She held his gaze. "I'm telling you that so you understand where I'm starting from in this conversation." Ryan looked at her without any change in expression. He didn't tell her she shouldn't have looked into his background. He didn't ask who she had spoken to. He just waited to hear what came next, which told her he was a man who understood that the substance of a moment mattered more than its edges. "You built something," Scarlett continued, "and then you lost it taking care of someone else. And then you started again from nothing, and you've been doing this job with more integrity than most people I've promoted 3 times over. And I stood in my own restaurant and said what I said to you in front of guests and staff, and I was wrong. I was completely wrong about what I thought I was looking at." She kept her voice level. "I'm sorry, Ryan. That's what I needed to say first." The office was quiet. Outside the closed door, the distant sounds of pre-service prep, the clatter of utensils, the low hum of the ventilation system continued without them. Ryan looked down briefly, then back up. When he spoke, his voice carried no heat and no magnanimity, just the same even quality she had been watching across the dining room floor for weeks. "I appreciate that," he said. "I wasn't going to ask for it." "I know," Scarlett said. "That's part of why I'm giving it." She pulled the resignation letter from the edge of her desk and slid it back toward him. "I'm not accepting this. I want you to stay, but I want to offer you something more than just your job back, because that's not actually enough to address what happened." She had spent part of the morning sketching out a proposal she hadn't fully formalized yet, but the shape of it was clear enough to present. The restaurants generate a significant amount of prepared food every week that doesn't get served end-of-night surplus, over-prepared portions, items that can't be held over, but are still completely good. Most of it gets discarded. I want to build a structured program to redirect that food to shelters and community distribution centers in the city. Coordinated, consistent, not a one-time donation drive. She looked at him. "I'd like you to help me design it." Ryan studied her for a moment. She could see him processing the offer carefully, not rushing to fill the space with enthusiasm or suspicion. "Why me?" he asked. "Because you've already been doing a version of this on your own without resources, without recognition, and without asking anyone's permission," Scarlett said. You know what the actual gaps look like. I know how to build the infrastructure. Those are different things, and both of them are necessary." She set her pen down on the desk. "I'm not asking you to be the face of a PR campaign. I'm asking you to help build something real." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone in the kitchen laughed at something, and the sound carried briefly through the walls before disappearing. "All right," he said. "I'll stay." Scarlett nodded. There was more she could have said, more acknowledgement. She could have offered more explanation of her own internal process over the past 2 weeks. She held most of it back. Some of it didn't need to be spoken aloud, and the rest of it wasn't for his benefit. It was the kind of thing a person needed to carry themselves. The harder conversation came 2 days later, and it happened in front of everyone. Scarlett had scheduled the all-staff meeting for 11 in the morning before the lunch shift began. She had told the general manager simply that she needed all available staff present and that attendance was required. She gave no other description of the agenda. When she walked into the dining room, chairs arranged in rough rows, 43 employees spread across them, some in uniform and some still in street clothes from their commute. The room had the particular quality of a group that had been speculating and hadn't landed on any consensus. Gerald Whitmore had called that morning to remind her that the board's position was unchanged. She had listened to him and thanked him for his time and ended the call. She was the majority stakeholder in the Hayes dining group, and she had not forgotten that. She stood at the front of the room without a podium, without notes, without the buffer of a presentation or a prepared statement she could hide behind. She looked out at the faces of people who had watched what happened at Table 9, some of them in person, some through a screen, and she took a breath. "I'm not here to make an announcement about the company," she said. "I'm here because something happened in this building in front of some of you that I need to address directly. Not through a statement, not through a third party. Here." The room was completely still. 3 weeks ago, I said something to a member of this staff that was dismissive, that was unfair, and that reflected a judgment I had made without any basis in fact. She didn't soften the language or redirect the responsibility. I looked at Ryan Carter, and I decided based on almost nothing what kind of person he was and what his situation meant. I was wrong. I was wrong in a way that I said out loud in front of guests and colleagues, and that had consequences for him and for this company that he did not deserve. She looked toward Ryan, who was seated at the far left of the second row, and then back at the room as a whole. "I'm saying this to all of you because it happened in front of people, and it should be addressed in front of people. Not managed. Addressed." No one moved. A woman near the back, one of the line cooks, a kitchen veteran named Donna, who had worked every station in the building at some point over the past 9 years, had her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching Scarlett with an expression that was not quite ready to soften. Donna had been one of the people standing closest to Table 9 on the night of the incident. She had heard every word. Scarlett met her gaze for a moment before continuing. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that one meeting fixes what was said or what it signaled to the people who work here. It doesn't. What I can tell you is what happens next." She laid out the food redistribution program clearly, and without embellishment, the partnership with 2 local shelters. She had already contacted the logistical framework she and Ryan had sketched out in her office 2 days ago, the plan to formalize it within the next 30 days. She explained that Ryan would be working with her directly on the program structure, in addition to his regular floor responsibilities, and that the program would be presented transparently to staff, not handed down as a finished product. When she finished, she didn't ask for applause, and she didn't invite immediate questions. She said she would stay for 30 minutes if anyone wanted to speak with her directly, and then she stepped to the side. The room took a moment to decompress. People shifted in their chairs. Patrick leaned over and said something quietly to the server beside him. Donna, near the back, uncrossed her arms slowly. She didn't come forward to speak with Scarlett, but before she left the room, she caught Ryan's eye and gave him a single nod, the kind that meant something specific between people who had worked long shifts in close quarters for years. Several staff members did come to speak with Scarlett in the 30 minutes that followed. Some with genuine questions about how the program would work, one with a referral to a shelter on the north side of the city that she hadn't yet contacted, another who mentioned a food bank 2 miles east that operated a late-night distribution window and had been struggling with supply consistency for months. Scarlett wrote down every name and address. Ryan stayed in his seat during most of it, talking with 2 colleagues beside him. At one point he looked up and caught her eye from across the room. He gave a single brief nod. She returned it and moved on to the next person waiting to speak with her. The media cycle ran its course the way media cycles did, loudly for a short period, and then not at all. The initial coverage of the viral clip was followed within the week by coverage of the public apology and the food program announcement. The second round of coverage was noticeably more measured in tone than the first, which was not nothing. Several outlets that had run the original clip ran follow-up pieces that framed the program launch as a meaningful response rather than a damage control maneuver, a distinction that mattered to Scarlett more than she had expected it to. Gerald Whitmore sent an email saying the board was satisfied with how the situation had been handled. Scarlett read it and filed it without responding. The food redistribution program launched on a Thursday, 31 days after Scarlett had first outlined it to Ryan in her office. The first delivery, 17 containers of surplus food from all 3 Hayes locations, went to a shelter 6 blocks from the restaurant that served close to 80 people on an average evening. The logistics were straightforward: a coordinated end-of-night collection, a contracted courier, a receiving contact at each partner organization. Ryan had mapped the entire process in a document that was clear enough that any floor manager could run it without him present. He had built it that way intentionally, so that the program didn't depend on any one person's continued involvement to function. Scarlett noticed that detail when she reviewed the document. She recognized the thinking behind it immediately, the kind of structural discipline that came from someone who had built and managed a business, who understood that the measure of a good system was its ability to outlast its creator. She made a brief note in the margin and sent the document back to him. He returned it the following day with the note acknowledged, and 2 additional distribution contacts added to the partner list. Neither of them commented on the exchange beyond what the document required. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. The restaurant ran the same as it always had: same floor rhythms, same service standards, same particular pressure of a fully booked Friday night. But something in the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was hard to name precisely. The staff didn't talk about the incident constantly. They didn't need to. It had been addressed, and it had moved into the past, which was where addressed things were supposed to go. What remained wasn't resentment or performance. It was something quieter, more like the subtle recalibration that happens when people realize they are being watched over by someone who takes the work seriously enough to admit when they've gotten it wrong. Ryan worked his shifts. He helped Patrick reset a station after a chaotic mid-service table turn. He declined a $200 tip from a guest who slid the bills across the table with the unmistakable implication that the money came with expectations attached. He walked out at the end of his shifts and went home the same way he always had. On a Tuesday evening in late November, about 6 weeks after the program had launched, Scarlett was leaving the restaurant after a late operational review. She came out through the front entrance and turned left toward the plaza, the same route she had taken on the night of the incident, the same path her heels had clicked across when she first saw Ryan crouched in the cold. The plaza was quiet at that hour, lit by the amber wash of the street lamps, the low wall along the north face of the building casting a thin strip of shadow across the pavement. Ryan was there. He had stopped near that same north wall, and there was a man sitting against it. Someone she hadn't seen before, younger than the man from that first night, with a jacket that wasn't doing enough against the temperature. Ryan had a paper bag with him, the same kind she had seen him carry to the alley weeks earlier. He set it down beside the man and crouched to say something. The man opened the bag, looked inside, and said something back. Ryan listened, nodded once. and remained where he was for a moment, while the man sorted through the contents. There was nothing ceremonial about any of it. It was practical and quiet, and entirely without audience in mind. Scarlett stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the plaza and watched, and this time what she felt was not the disorientation of the first night, not the unsettling collapse of a conclusion she had been certain of. What she felt was something steadier and more difficult to articulate. It was the particular recognition that comes when you finally understand that a person's character is not a performance they give under observation, but a habit they maintain when no one is looking. Ryan had been doing this long before she had seen it. He would continue doing it long after she stopped watching. The program she had built, the apology she had delivered, the recalibration she had undergone, none of it had changed him. It had only made her capable of finally seeing him accurately. She turned and walked to her car. She didn't call out to him. The moment didn't belong to her, and she understood that now with a clarity she hadn't earned cheaply. She carried it with her, the way she suspected she would carry it for a long time, not as guilt, which was useless, but as the kind of correction that changes the terms on which a person meets the next stranger who stands in front of them, asking for something they haven't yet explained.